Now, with regard to the physical composition itself, once I have that in place, I then have to consider the three things that I talked to you about, the idea of pose, perspective, and proportion. Pose is simply the fact that I have a slight aerial view down on this. The greeny pair is slightly behind, the yellowy pair is slightly in front. This one is standing up, this one is on its side. It's slightly to the right, and the shadow is cast to the left. I have a tablecloth and there's a few lines, and I like the idea of the cloth because I like the way the lines sort of create a certain distortion in the background, create a little bit more liveliness so that the pairs aren't too simplistic. From there we have what's called perspective. The definition of perspective is the illusion of depth. So, the idea that we have two types of perspective. We have linear and we have tonal. Linear perspective is the idea that, for example, let's say you're standing in the middle of a set of train tracks. You know the train tracks go right and left outside of your body. But as you look down the line of the train tracks, they appear, and that's the key word, they appear to narrow. And they eventually meet in what's called the vanishing point on the horizon line. That is the essence of perspective. And that is the essence of why drawing and learning to draw is so important. That's a classic case of what you know and what you see being different. We know the train tracks are the same width all the way down. And if you walk it, you'll see that. But as you look at it, it appears different. When you draw and when you paint, particularly when you're learning, draw what you see, not what you know. What you see. And that's what's important to separate, and that's what's important to understand. In terms of tonal perspective, that would be the idea that colours in the distance are paler and cooler. Colours in the foreground are stronger and warmer. For example, most mountains aren't blue. They simply appear blue as a consequence of the idea of the atmospheric conditions and the distance between you, the viewer, and the object itself, in this case the mountain, which is mostly just green and rock and things of that nature. From there, we then have the idea of proportion. Now, this is one of those that gets people quite confused, along with perspective in some respects, and that is, how do I determine the size of what I'm looking at? I've set up my composition, I understand its perspective, I understand its pose, how do I figure out the proportion? There are a number of ways in which you can do that. You have what's called sight sizing, you have gridding, where you put in a series of grids and you work off that, you have the measuring technique, which is this idea here, or you have guessing. Now, for the most part of those four choices, guessing is the one that you don't want to become dependent upon, because for the most part it is going to let you down. Gridding is not one that I would recommend on a regular basis, because I find that when people grid, they become so dependent on using a grid that they're terrified to actually try and draw freehand, which of course is not what you want. You want to be able to get yourself in a position where you're able to move outside of your house, move outside of your studio, even to your back garden first off, and then from there to different places in public, and start sketching and maybe build that up to maybe painting in public at some stage. But to do that, you need to have a drawing ability, so you've got to practice that. So part of that is when you're sitting outside and you're looking at, in this case we've got a controlled environment, but if you're sitting out in the street and you've got people and you've got buildings, you've got to be able to determine how to apply that. That's where the measuring technique comes into play.